The bitter wind howled through the mountains of northern Wyoming Territory that December morning in 1878, when Beatrice Rowland watched his breath freeze in the air and realized the Bennett family had just made him the butt of their cruelest joke yet. He stood outside the grand stone mansion where he had worked as a ranch hand for 3 years, his worn boots planted in snow that came up past his ankles. In his calloused hands, he held a deed to a property 30 miles north, near the Montana border, in a stretch of wilderness so remote that even the trappers avoided it in winter. The Bennett patriarch, Howard Bennett, had called it a bonus for loyal service, presenting the document with great ceremony in front of the other hands. But Beatrice had seen the smirks on the faces of Howard's 2 sons, Preston and Edgar, and heard the barely suppressed laughter of the visiting relatives who had gathered for the family's elaborate Christmas celebration. Prime real estate, Howard had declared with a straight face that must have taken considerable effort to maintain. A cabin on 40 acres. You have earned this, Rowland. A man of your dedication deserves his own place. Beatrice had felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly knocked him sideways. At 24 years old, he had been saving every penny of his wages, dreaming of the day he might own even a scrap of land to call his own. His parents had died of cholera when he was 16, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a strong work ethic they had instilled in him since childhood. He had drifted from ranch to ranch, building a reputation as someone who could gentle the wildest horses and work longer hours than men twice his size. The dream of land ownership had kept him going through brutal summers and frozen winters, through the loneliness that sometimes threatened to crush him in the middle of the night when he lay in the bunkhouse listening to the other men snore. And now, impossibly, that dream seemed within reach. It took him 2 days to make the journey north, riding his sturdy bay gelding and leading a pack mule loaded with supplies he had purchased in town, with nearly all his remaining savings. The map Howard had provided showed the property clearly enough, though the landmarks grew increasingly sparse as he traveled deeper into the wilderness. The temperature dropped steadily, and by the second night, he was camping in conditions that would have turned back a less determined man. When he finally reached the location marked on the deed, his heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. The cabin was barely visible beneath the thick coating of ice and snow that encased it. What should have been a simple log structure looked more like a sculpture carved from a glacier, with icicles as thick as fence posts hanging from the eaves. Drifts had piled against the walls until they nearly reached the roof. The windows, if there were any, had been completely obscured by ice. The door was frozen shut, requiring him to chip away at the ice with his axe for nearly an hour before he could pry it open far enough to squeeze inside. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The temperature inside felt barely warmer than the howling wind outside. Snow had blown through gaps in the walls and lay in delicate drifts across the floor. A rusted stove sat in one corner, its pipe so corroded that using it would likely result in death by smoke inhalation. The single room measured perhaps 15 feet by 12, with a ceiling so low he had to duck beneath the central beam. There was no furniture, no supplies, nothing but bare walls and the smell of abandonment. Beatrice stood in the frozen gloom and felt something dangerous kindle in his chest. Not despair, though that would have been reasonable. Not even anger, though he certainly had cause for it. What he felt was determination, pure and fierce and unshakable. He had been made a fool, certainly. The Bennett family had given him this frozen wreck specifically because they found it amusing to mock a man who dared to dream above his station. They probably expected him to slink back to the ranch within a week, defeated and humbled, ready to accept whatever scraps they chose to throw his way. Instead, Beatrice Rowland decided he would make this work. He would turn this joke into something real. He would prove that a man did not need wealth or family connections to build a life worth living. He would transform this frozen hell into a home, and he would do it through sheer stubborn will, if nothing else. The first week was the hardest stretch of days Beatrice had ever endured, and that included the time he had been thrown from a horse and cracked 3 ribs. He spent every daylight hour working on the cabin, starting with the most critical issues. Using materials he had brought with him and timber he cut from the surrounding forest, he patched the gaps in the walls, stuffed every crack with moss and clay, and replaced sections of the roof that had rotted through. He hauled the dangerous stove outside and cleaned it as thoroughly as possible, then carefully tested it before daring to build a fire. That first real fire felt like a miracle. The warmth spread slowly through the tiny space, melting the ice that had formed on the interior walls and creating puddles he had to sweep outside before they refroze. He stood as close to the stove as he dared, feeling the heat penetrate his frozen clothes, and allowed himself a grim smile. Progress. Small, difficult, but real. He slept in his bedroll next to the stove, waking every few hours to feed more wood into the flames. In the morning he would resume work, pushing his body to its limits and beyond. He ate simple meals of beans and salted meat, supplemented occasionally by rabbits he managed to snare. The isolation did not bother him as much as he had feared it might. In fact, there was something almost peaceful about the solitude, about having only his own goals and his own standards to meet. By the end of the second week, the cabin was weatherproof and reasonably warm when the stove was going. Beatrice had built a simple bed frame and a crude table with 2 chairs. He had carved storage shelves into the walls and created a workspace where he could maintain his tools. The windows he had uncovered and scraped clean revealed a view of snow-covered mountains that took his breath away when the morning sun hit them just right. He was running low on supplies and would need to make a trip to the nearest town, which, according to his map, was a place called Frost Ridge about 20 miles to the east. He had passed through it briefly on his way north and remembered it as a small settlement with a general store, a saloon, and perhaps a dozen permanent buildings. Not much, but enough to provide the necessities. The journey to Frost Ridge took most of a day, as he had to navigate terrain that would have been challenging even without the snow. He reached the town in the late afternoon and headed straight for the general store, a weathered building with a painted sign that had faded to near illegibility. The interior was warm and cluttered, packed with goods that ranged from farming implements to ladies' hats. A pot-bellied stove in the center radiated heat, around which several men sat playing cards and smoking pipes. They looked up when Beatrice entered, their conversation dying away as they studied the stranger. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s with a magnificent white beard and shrewd eyes. "Help you?" he asked, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Need supplies," Beatrice said, approaching the counter. "Flour, cornmeal, coffee, salt, nails if you have them, and lamp oil." The proprietor nodded and began gathering the requested items. "You are new to the area, passing through or planning to stay?" "Staying. I have property about 20 miles west of here." One of the card players, a lean man with a weathered face, let out a low whistle. 20 miles west? That is rough country, friend. Nothing out that way but bears and blizzards." "And the old Hutchinson place," another man added. "But that has been abandoned for years. Old man Hutchinson froze to death in there, must be 5 winters back. Nobody wanted it after that." Beatrice kept his expression carefully neutral. "The cabin has a new owner now." The proprietor, who had introduced himself as Samuel Greaves, looked at Beatrice with something that might have been respect. "Takes a certain kind of man to winter in that country. You seem capable enough, but it is a hard life. Nearest neighbor is probably 10 miles in any direction." "I am not afraid of hard work or solitude," Beatrice replied, counting out coins to pay for his purchases. The amount made a serious dent in his remaining funds, but he had no choice. "Fair enough," Samuel said, wrapping the goods in brown paper. "You need anything else, we are here." Town does not look like much, but folks help each other out when needed. Beatrice thanked him and was loading his purchases onto his horse when he heard the sound of raised voices from down the street. He turned to see a small crowd gathering near what appeared to be the livery stable. Curiosity drew him closer, though he reminded himself he had a long ride ahead and should not delay. As he approached, he could make out the details of the scene. A fancy carriage stood in the muddy street, far too elegant for a rough settlement like Frost Ridge. The driver, a man in expensive livery, was arguing with a younger woman who stood beside the carriage looking simultaneously furious and frightened. "Miss Ellington, your father's instructions were absolutely clear," the driver was saying, his voice carrying a mixture of exasperation and finality. "I am to leave you here and return immediately to Cheyenne. He said you needed time to reflect on your behavior and appreciate the comforts you have taken for granted." "This is insane," the woman shot back, and Beatrice could hear the cultured accent that marked her as someone from a wealthy background. "You cannot simply abandon me in the middle of nowhere with winter coming on. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to stay?" "There is a boarding house, miss. Your father has arranged for your accommodation for the next 3 months. Perhaps by then you will have learned the value of obedience and reconsidered your stubborn refusal to marry Mr. Pemberton." The woman's face flushed with anger. "I will never marry that pompous, arrogant, cruel man, no matter how long father makes me stay in this frozen wasteland. Pemberton is a monster and you know it. You have all seen how he treats his servants, his horses. I would rather die than become his wife." "That is not my concern, miss." The driver climbed back onto his seat, clearly eager to be gone. "Your trunks are there. Good day." The woman looked around desperately at the gathered crowd, seeking help or sympathy, but most of the townspeople avoided her gaze. A woman in expensive traveling clothes meant trouble, meant complications with powerful people, meant problems no one in a small frontier town wanted to invite. One by one, they turned away and returned to their business. Beatrice watched as the carriage rolled away, leaving the young woman standing alone beside 3 large trunks. She stood frozen for a moment, then seemed to gather herself. Her chin came up, her shoulders straightened, and she picked up the smallest trunk and began dragging it toward the boarding house the driver had mentioned. Something in that gesture, that refusal to collapse or beg, resonated with Beatrice. He found himself walking toward her before he had consciously decided to help. "Let me," he said quietly, reaching for the trunk. She turned to look at him, and Beatrice got his first clear view of her face. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair escaping from beneath a fashionable hat and eyes that were a striking green even in the fading afternoon light. Pretty, certainly, but more than that. There was intelligence in those eyes and courage and a fierceness that reminded him of the wild horses he had spent his life learning to understand. "I can manage," she said, her voice still tight with anger and humiliation. "I know you can," Beatrice replied, "but you do not have to." Something in his tone made her pause. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his worn but clean clothes, his weathered face, the quiet competence that came from years of hard work. Finally, she released the trunk and stepped back. "Thank you," she said, and this time her voice was softer. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Rowland, Beatrice Rowland." He picked up the trunk, surprised by its weight. "And you are Miss Ellington, Zinnia Ellington," she confirmed, moving to grab another trunk. Together they managed to carry all three to the boarding house, a two-story structure that looked reasonably well maintained. The proprietress, a stout woman named Mrs. Walsh, greeted Zinnia with professional courtesy but little warmth. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the left, Mrs. Walsh said, accepting the payment Zinnia counted out from a small purse. "Meals are served at 7 in the morning and 6 in the evening. No gentlemen callers, no alcohol, and I expect you to keep your room tidy." Zinnia nodded, her expression carefully blank. Beatrice helped carry the trunks upstairs to a small but clean room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the main street. When the last trunk was in place, he turned to leave. "Mr. Rowland," Zinnia said suddenly, "thank you, truly. You are the only person in this town who bothered to help." "People are frightened," Beatrice said. "Your father sounds like a powerful man, and folks in towns like this cannot afford to cross powerful men." "And you are not frightened?" Beatrice allowed himself a small smile. "I am too poor to be worth anyone's attention. Your father would not waste time ruining a man who has nothing to lose." It was meant to be light, but Zinnia's expression grew serious. "Everyone has something to lose, Mr. Rowland, but thank you nonetheless. I hope your journey home is safe." Beatrice tipped his hat and left, making his way back to his horse. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and he knew he should have left hours ago. The ride back to the cabin in the dark would be treacherous, but he had no choice now. As he rode through the frozen wilderness, his thoughts kept returning to Zinnia Ellington. There had been something in her eyes, a mixture of fear and defiance that stayed with him. He wondered what kind of father would abandon his daughter in a rough frontier town as punishment for refusing a marriage. He wondered what kind of man this Pemberton was, that a woman would choose exile over becoming his wife. Then he shook his head, trying to clear those thoughts away. Zinnia's problems were not his concern. He had his own challenges to face, his own battles to fight. A wealthy woman from Cheyenne and a dirt-poor cowboy trying to survive in an abandoned cabin had no business occupying each other's thoughts. But the memory of her green eyes stayed with him nonetheless. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and satisfying. Beatrice worked on improving the cabin during the day, building furniture and hunting for fresh meat when possible. Every 10 days or so, he would make the journey to Frost Ridge for supplies, timing his visits to conserve his dwindling funds as carefully as possible. On each visit, he found himself looking for Zinnia without quite admitting to himself that he was doing so. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of her walking down the street, usually alone, her expensive clothes growing gradually more worn and practical. She stood out in the rough town like a rose in a wheat field, and he was not the only man who noticed. On his third trip to town, he saw her leaving the general store with a small bundle of purchases. She spotted him at the same moment and offered a smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "Mr. Rowland," she said warmly, "I was hoping I might see you again." "Miss Ellington," he touched his hat brim. "Are you settling in?" Her smile faltered slightly. "As well as can be expected. Mrs. Walsh runs a respectable establishment, but it is." She paused, choosing her words carefully, isolating. "The townspeople are polite but distant." "I understand why, truly, but it makes the days very long." Beatrice found himself saying, before he could reconsider, "Would you like to get coffee? There is a place next to the saloon that is suitable for ladies." Her face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I would like that very much." They sat in the small cafe, which was little more than a room with 4 tables and a harried-looking woman who served coffee and pie. Zinnia wrapped her hands around the chipped mug as though drawing warmth from it, and Beatrice noticed her gloves were worn through at the fingertips. "Tell me about your property," she said. "Is it what you hoped for?" Beatrice let out a short laugh. "It was a joke, actually. A very cruel one. The family I worked for gave me a deed to an abandoned, half-frozen cabin as a kind of mockery. I think they expected me to give up and come crawling back." Zinnia's eyes flashed with anger on his behalf. "That is terrible. People can be so needlessly cruel." She paused, then added quietly, "as I have recently learned firsthand." "Your father," Beatrice said, then hesitated. "Forgive me, it is not my business." "No, it is all right." Zinnia stared down at her coffee. "My father is Maxwell Ellington. He owns half of Cheyenne and thinks he should own the other half too. He built his fortune from nothing, which I admire, but it made him believe that everything and everyone has a price. When Roger Pemberton offered a business partnership in exchange for my hand, Father simply assumed I would agree. He could not comprehend that I might have objections." "What kind of objections?" Beatrice asked gently. Zinnia's hands tightened around the mug. "Roger is wealthy, well-connected, and utterly without conscience. He treats people as possessions, things to be used and discarded. I have seen him beat a servant nearly to death for spilling wine. I have watched him run a horse until it collapsed, then shoot it in the street because it could no longer serve him. And Father expects me to spend my life with this man, to bear his children, to pretend everything is fine while I die a little more inside each day." The bitterness in her voice was matched by the determination in her eyes. "So I refused. I refused again and again, no matter how Father threatened or pleaded or tried to bribe me. Finally, he decided that 3 months in this provincial wasteland, as he called it, would break my spirit and make me grateful to accept Roger's proposal." "Will it?" Beatrice asked. Zinnia looked at him directly, and he saw steel beneath the cultured exterior. "Never. I will stay here forever before I marry that man. I will work as a washerwoman or a seamstress or whatever I must do to survive. My father thinks he is punishing me, but he has actually given me a gift. He has shown me that I can exist outside his control, outside the cage he built around my life." Beatrice felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of kindred spirits. "That is how I felt when I saw that frozen wreck of a cabin. Everyone expected me to give up, to accept that someone like me could not have dreams above my station, but I decided to prove them wrong. The cabin is still rough, still cold on bad nights, but it is mine. I made it with my own hands, and nobody can take that away from me." "I wish I could see it," Zinnia said, and there was genuine longing in her voice. "It sounds wonderful." "It is just a cabin," Beatrice said, but he was pleased nonetheless. "One room, barely any furniture, miles from anywhere. But it is yours," Zinnia said. "That makes it wonderful." They talked for another hour, and Beatrice learned that Zinnia had been educated by private tutors, could speak 3 languages, played piano beautifully, and had a sharp mind for business that her father had never bothered to utilize. She learned that Beatrice had been orphaned young, had taught himself to read using newspapers and old books he traded for, and dreamed of eventually building a real ranch where he could breed horses. When they finally parted ways, Beatrice rode back to his cabin with a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. He tried to tell himself it was simply the pleasure of good conversation, of connecting with another person after weeks of solitude. But he knew, in the deep, honest part of himself, that it was more than that. Zinnia Ellington had gotten under his skin in a way no woman ever had before. Over the following weeks, their friendship deepened. Every time Beatrice came to town, He would seek Zinnia out, and they would spend an hour or two talking over coffee or walking through the snowy streets. He learned that she was remarkably resilient, finding ways to make her limited funds stretch, and even taking in mending work to earn a few extra coins. She was fascinated by his descriptions of life in the wilderness, asking detailed questions about how he survived, what he ate, how he kept warm. "I think you would have made an excellent pioneer woman," Beatrice teased her one afternoon in mid-February. They were sitting in the cafe again, and outside the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes. "Do not assume I could not," Zinnia replied with mock severity. "I may have been raised in luxury, but I am not helpless. I can cook reasonably well, I can sew, and I am stronger than I look." "I never doubted it," Beatrice said, and he meant it. In the weeks since they had met, he had watched Zinnia transform from a frightened, angry girl into a woman who was discovering her own capabilities. The change was fascinating to witness. "The truth is," Zinnia said more quietly, "I have been happier these past weeks than I was in years of living in my father's mansion. Oh, I miss hot baths and good food and comfortable furniture. But I do not miss the constant pressure, the endless social obligations, the feeling that I was just an ornament meant to increase father's prestige. Here, I am just myself. It is frightening but also liberating." Beatrice nodded, understanding completely. "That is how I feel about the cabin. It is hard work, every single day, but it is my work, my choices, my life." Zinnia looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You are a remarkable man, Beatrice Rowland. I hope you know that." He felt heat rise in his cheeks and tried to cover his embarrassment by taking a drink of coffee. The truth was that he had been thinking about Zinnia constantly, even when he was alone at the cabin. He found himself working harder to improve the place, imagining what she might think of each small addition. He would catch himself starting mental conversations with her, planning things to tell her the next time they met. He was falling in love with her, and that terrified him. A woman like Zinnia Ellington, educated and cultured and accustomed to fine things, could never be happy with a man like him. Even if she claimed to enjoy her simple life in Frost Ridge, that was temporary, a rebellion against her father. Eventually, she would return to her world and he would remain in his. The gulf between them was simply too wide, but his heart, apparently, did not care about logic or sense. March arrived with a savage blizzard that kept Beatrice trapped in his cabin for 5 straight days. He spent the time carving, a hobby he had taken up to pass the long evenings. He had started with simple things, wooden spoons and bowls, but had gradually grown more ambitious. Now he was working on something special, though he tried not to think too hard about why he was making it or who he hoped to give it to. When the storm finally cleared, he made his way to Frost Ridge, worried about Zinnia despite telling himself he was being foolish. The journey took longer than usual, as the fresh snow had made the trails nearly impassable, but he pushed through with determination. He found Zinnia in the boarding house, sitting in the small common room that Mrs. Walsh maintained. She was mending a dress, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency, and she looked thinner than he remembered. When she saw him, her face lit up with such obvious joy that it made his chest ache. "Beatrice, I was so worried. The storm was terrible. I kept thinking about you alone in that cabin." "It takes more than a blizzard to trouble me," he said, pleased that she had been thinking about him. "Are you well? You look hungry," she finished with a wry smile. "I ran out of funds faster than I expected. Mrs. Walsh has been kind enough to let me work for my meals, but it is still less food than I am accustomed to. I will survive." Beatrice felt anger flash through him. Her father had exiled her to this place with barely enough money to get by, apparently thinking deprivation would break her spirit. Instead, it seemed to be breaking her health. "Come with me," he said suddenly. "Where?" "To the general store. I need to pick up supplies and I want your advice on something." It was a transparent excuse, but Zinnia went along with it. At the store, Beatrice made his usual purchases, then added several items he claimed were for himself, but were actually portions he could share with Zinnia. He also bought a wool shawl that he said was for his non-existent sister, then insisted Zinnia take it when they were outside because his sister could not use it after all. "You are lying," Zinnia said, but she wrapped the shawl around her shoulders anyway, and he could see she was grateful for the warmth. "You do not have a sister and you bought this for me." "Maybe," Beatrice admitted. "Are you going to refuse it?" "No," she said softly. "I am not that proud." "Thank you, Beatrice, for everything. You have been so kind to me and I do not even know how to repay you." "You do not need to repay me. You are my friend." "Is that what we are?" Zinnia asked, and there was something in her voice that made his heart race. "Just friends." They were standing in the street, snow falling gently around them, and Beatrice knew this was a moment that would determine everything that came after. He could play it safe, could agree that friendship was all they were, could protect his heart from the inevitable pain of loving someone he could never truly have. Instead, he heard himself say, "I hope we could be more than that. If you wanted." Zinnia's eyes widened, and for a terrible moment he thought he had made a catastrophic mistake. Then her face softened, and she stepped closer to him. "I have been hoping you would say something like that for weeks," she admitted. "I know it is impractical. I know there are 100 reasons why we should not even consider this, but I care about you, Beatrice, more than I have ever cared about anyone." "I care about you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think about you all the time. When I am working on the cabin, I imagine showing it to you. When I am riding through the mountains, I wish you were there to see the views. You have become the most important person in my life, and I do not know what to do about that." "Kiss me," Zinnia said simply. "That seems like a good place to start." So he did, right there in the middle of the street, with snow falling on their heads and the whole town potentially watching. It was the best decision he had ever made. Her lips were soft and cold from the winter air, but they warmed quickly against his. The kiss started gentle and tentative, then deepened as they stopped questioning whether this was wise and simply let themselves feel. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Zinnia's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were bright with happiness. "Well then," she said, trying to sound composed but failing completely. "I suppose that settles that." Beatrice laughed, giddy with relief and joy. "I suppose it does, though I have no idea what we do now. I still live in a frozen shack in the wilderness, and you are still the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the territory." "We figure it out," Zinnia said firmly. "Together. That is what people do when they care about each other. They figure it out." Over the following weeks, their relationship bloomed despite the challenging circumstances. Beatrice began making more frequent trips to town, worried about leaving Zinnia alone for too long. She was growing thinner, and he could see the toll that her reduced circumstances were taking. Mrs. Walsh was not unkind, but she ran a business, not a charity, and there was only so much work Zinnia could do to earn her keep. Finally, on a cold morning in late March, Beatrice made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "Come live with me," he said. They were in the cafe, and Zinnia had been telling him about a difficult encounter with some traveling businessmen who had made inappropriate assumptions about a young woman living alone in a boarding house. Zinnia stared at him. "What? Come live with me at the cabin. I know it is improper. I know people will talk, but I cannot stand seeing you struggle like this. The cabin is warm now and I have plenty of food. There is room for both of us, and I promise I will be a gentleman. You can have the bed and I will sleep on the floor, but at least you will be safe and fed." "Beatrice, I cannot. Your reputation would be destroyed. People would think—" "I do not care what people think," he interrupted. "I care about you, and I would rather have folks gossiping about me than know you are going hungry and dealing with men who disrespect you." Zinnia's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure, truly sure? Because once I leave this town with you, there is no going back. Everyone will assume we are living in sin. You will be judged as harshly as I will." "Then let them judge," Beatrice said. "You said we would figure it out together." "This is me trying to figure it out. Will you come?" She reached across the table and took his hand, and he marveled at how such a simple touch could make his heart pound. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will come with you." They left Frost Ridge 2 days later, as soon as Beatrice could arrange to transport Zinnia's trunks. Mrs. Walsh pursed her lips disapprovingly when Zinnia settled her account, but said nothing. Samuel Greaves at the general store was more supportive, pulling Beatrice aside to say quietly, "You are a good man, Rowland. That girl has been dealt a rough hand, and I am glad she has someone looking out for her. You need anything at all, you come see me." The journey to the cabin took most of a day, and Beatrice watched Zinnia anxiously, worried she would realize what a mistake she was making. But she seemed cheerful despite the difficult travel, exclaiming over the beauty of the landscape and asking questions about the wildlife they might encounter. When they finally reached the cabin, Beatrice tried to see it through her eyes. He had worked so hard to make it livable, but it was still just one small room in the middle of nowhere. The furniture was rough and handmade, the accommodations primitive compared to what she had grown up with. But Zinnia climbed down from the horse and stood looking at the cabin with an expression of wonder. "It is perfect," she breathed. "Beatrice, it is absolutely perfect. It is small," he felt compelled to point out, "and plain. And the wind howls through the walls on bad nights despite my best efforts." "It is yours," she said, echoing their earlier conversation. "And now it is mine too. That makes it perfect." Moving her inside, helping her unpack her trunks, showing her where everything was kept, all of it felt surreal. Beatrice had been alone for so long that having another person in his space was strange and wonderful, and more than a little overwhelming. Zinnia, for her part, threw herself into organizing the cabin with enthusiasm, rearranging things to make the space more efficient and exclaiming over his carved wooden bowls. That first evening, they cooked dinner together, a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. They sat at the table Beatrice had built, eating by lamplight, and talked until the fire burned low. When it was time for bed, Beatrice made a pallet on the floor near the stove, giving Zinnia privacy to change and settle in the bed. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathing, still barely believing she was there. This woman who had been raised in luxury, who could have had anything and anyone, had chosen to come live in his frozen shack in the wilderness. It seemed impossible, like something from a dream he might wake from at any moment. "Beatrice?" Her voice came softly from the darkness. "Are you awake?" "Yes. Thank you for everything. I know this is strange and complicated, but I want you to know I am happy. Happier than I have been in years." "So am I," he replied, and meant it with his whole heart. The weeks that followed were both challenging and unexpectedly joyful. Living together in such close quarters required adjustment on both sides. Zinnia had to learn the rhythms of frontier life, how to cook on a temperamental stove, how to conserve water, how to dress in layers to stay warm. Beatrice had to learn to accommodate another person's needs and preferences, to communicate about decisions that had previously been his alone. But they also laughed together, cooked together, worked together to improve the cabin. Zinnia proved to be remarkably capable once she learned the necessary skills. She took over most of the cooking, freeing Beatrice to focus on outdoor work. She sewed curtains for the windows and cushions for the chairs, transforming the stark interior into something that felt like a real home. She even helped with chopping wood, though Beatrice worried constantly about her injuring herself. They maintained the propriety they had promised, Beatrice sleeping on the floor each night despite Zinnia's gentle protests that he should not sacrifice his comfort. But the line between them grew increasingly blurred. They would sit close together in the evenings, her head on his shoulder as they talked. They held hands while walking outside. They kissed, carefully at first, then with increasing passion as the weeks went by. One evening in mid-April, with spring finally beginning to soften the harsh landscape, they sat outside watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Zinnia was quiet, and Beatrice sensed she had something on her mind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. She was silent for a long moment before answering. "My father sent another letter. It arrived at the general store the last time you went for supplies, and Mr. Greaves gave it to you to bring to me." Beatrice remembered. He had handed her the letter and then given her privacy to read it. She had not mentioned it since, and he had not asked. "He says my 3 months are nearly up," Zinnia continued. "He expects me to return to Cheyenne by the end of the month, and he assumes I will be sufficiently humbled to accept Roger's proposal. He has even set a date for the wedding, June 15th. Beatrice felt his chest tighten. He had known this was coming, had known their time together was borrowed, but hearing it stated so baldly still hit him like a physical blow. "Are you going to go?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Zinnia turned to look at him, and her eyes were fierce. "No, I am not going back. Not to him, not to that life, not ever. But I wanted to talk to you about it because this affects you too. If I stay, if I refuse to return, my father will almost certainly cut me off completely. I will have no money, no resources, nothing but what I can earn myself. And people will talk about both of us. They will say terrible things. Your life will become much more difficult." "Do you think I care about that?" Beatrice asked. "Do you think gossip from people I barely know matters more to me than having you here?" "I think you might care more than you realize," Zinnia said quietly. "I think we both might, once we face the full weight of society's disapproval. But I am willing to bear it if you are. I am willing to stay here, to build a life with you, to face whatever consequences come, if you want me to." Beatrice took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I want you to stay more than I want my next breath, but I need you to be sure, Zinnia. This is hard country and it will be a hard life. I am working to improve the cabin, to maybe expand it someday, to build something real. But I will never be wealthy. I will never be able to give you the things you grew up with." "I do not want those things," Zinnia said fiercely. "I want this. I want you. I want a life where I make my own choices, where I am valued for myself and not for my father's money or business connections. I want to wake up every morning next to the man I love and know that we built this together." "The man you love," Beatrice repeated, his heart hammering against his ribs. Zinnia smiled, soft and radiant. "Did you think I would append my entire life for someone I merely liked? I love you, Beatrice Rowland. I have loved you since you were the only person kind enough to help me when I was abandoned in Frost Ridge. I have loved you more with each passing day, watching you work so hard to build something meaningful, watching you treat me with respect and patience and tenderness. I love you, and I want to spend my life with you, if you will have me." Beatrice pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion he had been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said roughly. "I have loved you for so long I cannot remember when it started." And if you will have me, if you will accept a poor cowboy with nothing but a frozen shack and big dreams, then I will spend every day of my life working to make you happy." "Then it is settled," Zinnia said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I am not going back to Cheyenne. I am staying here with you." "We should get married," Beatrice said suddenly. "As soon as possible. I do not want people thinking poorly of you, and I want everyone to know that you are mine and I am yours properly and officially." "I would like that," Zinnia said softly, "more than anything." They rode to Frost Ridge 3 days later and were married by the traveling circuit judge who happened to be in town. Samuel Greaves and his wife served as witnesses, and Mrs. Walsh attended, her earlier disapproval apparently softened by the prospect of a proper wedding. It was a simple ceremony, nothing like the elaborate society wedding Zinnia's father had no doubt planned, but it felt perfect. Zinnia wore a simple blue dress she had made herself, and Beatrice wore his best clothes, which were still worn and patched but clean. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Beatrice kissed his bride with joy so intense it felt like it might crack him open. They celebrated with a modest meal at the cafe, joined by the Greaves family and a few other townspeople who had warmed to them over the months. Then they rode back to the cabin, which was now officially their home together. That night, Beatrice finally moved into the bed he had built, holding his wife in his arms as she slept. The cabin was still small, still rough, still miles from civilization. But it was theirs, and it was filled with love, and that made it more valuable than any mansion. The spring and summer months were magical. With Zinnia by his side, Beatrice worked harder than ever to improve their property. He expanded the cabin, adding a second room that would serve as a bedroom, giving them more space. He built a proper chicken coop and acquired 6 hens from a farmer near Frost Ridge, giving them fresh eggs. He cleared land for a vegetable garden, and Zinnia threw herself into planting, her hands growing calloused from the work but her face glowing with satisfaction. They were happy in a way that felt almost defiant. The world had expected them both to fail, to give up on their dreams and accept the limitations others tried to impose. Instead, they were thriving, building something real and lasting through sheer determination and love. In June, a letter arrived from Zinnia's father. It was brief and cold, informing her that she was no longer welcome in his home and that he considered her dead to him. He had given Roger Pemberton a generous financial settlement as compensation for the broken engagement, and he expected no further contact from his disobedient daughter. Beatrice held Zinnia while she cried, angry at a man who could so easily discard his own child. But underneath the tears, he could see Zinnia's relief. The final tie had been cut. She was truly free now, with no obligations pulling her back to a life she had never wanted. "I am sorry," she said, wiping her eyes. "I know I should not be crying. This is what I chose and I do not regret it, but it still hurts." "Of course it hurts," Beatrice said gently. "He is your father. You are allowed to grieve even as you move forward with the life you want." She hugged him tighter. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You were brave enough to walk away from everything you knew," he replied. "You were strong enough to build a new life from nothing. You were willing to take a chance on a cowboy with a frozen shack and big dreams. That is what you did to deserve me." By August, Zinnia realized she was pregnant. They were both thrilled and terrified, aware of how dangerous childbirth could be, especially so far from medical help. But Zinnia was healthy and strong from months of physical work, and they had time to prepare. Beatrice began making frequent trips to Frost Ridge, building relationships with the women in town who had experience with childbirth. Mrs. Greaves, who had raised 5 children of her own, took Zinnia under her wing, providing advice and promising to come stay with them when the time came. In late January of 1879, with snow falling softly outside, Zinnia went into labor. Mrs. Greaves and another experienced woman from town had arrived 2 days earlier, sensing the baby would come soon. Beatrice was banished to the outer room while the women worked, and he spent hours pacing, praying to a God he was not sure he believed in, making desperate bargains about all the things he would do if Zinnia and the baby survived. When he finally heard the thin wail of a newborn, followed by Zinnia's exhausted but joyful laughter, he felt his knees go weak with relief. Mrs. Greaves emerged, smiling broadly. "You have a son, Mr. Rowland, a healthy, strong boy, and your wife did beautifully. She is tired, but she will be fine." Beatrice went to Zinnia, who was propped up in bed holding a tiny bundle. She looked exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but she was smiling. "Meet your son," she said softly, turning the bundle so Beatrice could see the tiny red face, the miniature fists waving in the air. Beatrice sat on the edge of the bed, carefully touching one tiny hand with his finger. The baby's fist closed around it immediately, and Beatrice felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. "He is perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect. I cannot believe we made something so incredible." "What should we name him?" Zinnia asked. They had discussed names during the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on anything. Now, looking at his son's face, Beatrice knew exactly what felt right. "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Rowland. It means God is my judge, and I figure that is appropriate. Let people judge us all they want. We know the truth of what we have built here." "Daniel Rowland," Zinnia repeated, testing the name. "I love it. Hello, Daniel. Welcome to your frozen shack in the wilderness. I promise we will do our best to make it a good home for you." The first months with a newborn were challenging in ways Beatrice had never imagined. The constant crying, the sleepless nights, the worry every time Daniel sneezed or coughed, all of it pushed them to their limits. But it also brought them closer together. This shared project of keeping a tiny human alive and helping him grow. Zinnia was a natural mother, patient and loving even when exhausted. Beatrice learned to change diapers, to warm bottles of goat's milk when Zinnia needed rest, to walk the floor with Daniel for hours when nothing else would settle him. The cabin that had once seemed cozy now felt cramped, but they made it work. Spring came again, then summer, and Daniel grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, curious baby who laughed at everything. Watching Zinnia with their son, seeing her face light up when Daniel smiled or reached for her, Beatrice felt a contentment so deep it sometimes scared him. How had he gotten so lucky? How had the frozen shack that was meant to be a joke become the foundation for such happiness? In the fall of 1879, Samuel Greaves approached Beatrice with an interesting proposition. A wealthy rancher from Cheyenne was looking to purchase horses, specifically well-trained mounts that could handle rough terrain. Samuel had told him about Beatrice's skill with horses, and the man was interested in placing an order. "It could be good money," Samuel explained. "Real money, enough to expand your property, maybe buy more land. But it would be a lot of work, and you would need space to keep and train multiple horses." Beatrice discussed it with Zinnia that evening, laying out the possibilities and the challenges. Training horses had always been his greatest skill, but doing it professionally would require significant investment and risk. "Do it," Zinnia said without hesitation. "You are incredible with horses, Beatrice. I have watched you gentle that wild mare you caught last spring, turning her from terrified and aggressive to calm and trusting in just a few weeks. People would pay well for that skill. And we could use the income to make improvements, to secure our future and Daniel's." So Beatrice accepted the commission and threw himself into the work. He built a small stable and corral, then began acquiring horses to train. It was exhausting work on top of everything else he had to do, but it was also deeply satisfying. Word spread about the cowboy who could train horses better than anyone in the territory, and soon he had more work than he could handle. The money allowed them to make real improvements to the property. They added another room to the cabin, expanding it into a proper house. They bought better furniture, real glass for the windows, a proper cookstove that did not require constant adjustment. They acquired more land, expanding their property to include a good-sized pasture and a reliable water source. By 1881, they were no longer scraping by. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, secure in ways Beatrice had never imagined possible during those first desperate weeks in the frozen cabin. Daniel was 2 years old now, a bright, energetic boy who followed Beatrice everywhere, and showed signs of inheriting his father's way with animals. Watching his son carefully approach the horses, mimicking the calm, patient movements Beatrice had taught him, filled him with pride so intense it was almost painful. One summer evening, sitting on the porch they had built, watching the sunset with Zinnia beside him and Daniel playing in the grass, Beatrice found himself thinking about how everything had started. "The Bennett family gave me that frozen shack as a joke," he said quietly. "They wanted to humiliate me to remind me of my place. They thought I would fail. Instead, you succeeded beyond anyone's expectations," Zinnia said, taking his hand. "You turned their joke into something wonderful." "We did," Beatrice corrected. "I could not have done any of this without you." "You brought life to this place, Zinnia. You made it a home instead of just a shelter. You gave me a reason to build something lasting instead of just surviving day to day." Zinnia leaned her head on his shoulder. "We saved each other, I think. I was drowning in my father's world, suffocating under expectations I could never meet. You showed me that another life was possible. You gave me freedom and love and purpose." "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked. It was a question he had never quite dared to voice before. "Do you ever miss the luxury, the comfort, the society you gave up?" Zinnia was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. "Sometimes I miss hot baths," she admitted, "and good chocolate, and books, so many books, but do I regret leaving? Do I wish I had stayed and married Roger Pemberton? Not for even a single second. This life is hard, Beatrice, but it is real. It is mine. I have a husband who respects me, a son who fills my heart with joy, work that matters, and land we built together. I would choose this 1,000 times over anything my father's world could offer." Beatrice kissed the top of her head. "I love you more than I have words to express." "I love you too," she replied, "even when you track mud all over my clean floors." They laughed together, easy and comfortable in a way that came from truly knowing each other. Beatrice thought about the scared, lonely young woman he had met in Frost Ridge nearly 3 years earlier, and the man he had been then, desperate to prove he was worth something. They had both changed so much, grown into the people they were meant to be. In the fall of 1881, Zinnia discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect, or perhaps simply because she was more confident in her own body and capabilities. She continued working almost until the day she went into labor, much to Mrs. Greaves' exasperation. Their daughter was born on a cold February morning in 1882, arriving quickly and with considerably less drama than Daniel's birth. She had Zinnia's green eyes and a full head of dark hair, and she was perfect. "Margaret," Zinnia said, naming her daughter after her mother, who had died when Zinnia was young. "Margaret Rowland." Beatrice held his daughter with the same wonder he had felt when Daniel was born, marveling at how something so tiny and fragile could exist. Daniel, who had been promised a baby brother or sister and was not quite sure what to make of the reality, peered at Margaret with intense concentration. "She is very small," he observed seriously. "Will she get bigger?" "She will," Beatrice assured him. "And someday you will teach her all the things you know, about horses and the land and how to be brave." Daniel seemed satisfied with this answer and carefully patted Margaret's tiny hand with one finger, mimicking the gentleness Beatrice used with new foals. The years that followed were full and rich, and sometimes overwhelming. Raising two children while building a business required constant effort from both Beatrice and Zinnia, but they fell into a rhythm that worked for them. Beatrice trained horses and gradually expanded their holdings, while Zinnia managed the household, the garden, and the chickens, as well as doing the books for the horse training business. She had a sharp head for numbers, catching inefficiencies and opportunities that Beatrice would have missed. Daniel grew into a confident, capable boy who seemed to have inherited the best qualities of both his parents. He had Beatrice's patience and skill with animals, combined with Zinnia's quick mind and determination. Margaret, as she emerged from babyhood, proved to be stubborn, fearless, and utterly charming. She had everyone in the family wrapped around her tiny finger and knew it. In the spring of 1884, something unexpected happened. A fancy carriage appeared on their property and Beatrice tensed, prepared to defend his family against whatever trouble was coming. But when the carriage door opened, an elderly man emerged and Beatrice saw Zinnia's face go white. "That is my father," she whispered. Maxwell Ellington looked older than Beatrice had expected, his hair completely white, his movements stiff. He approached slowly, taking in the expanded cabin, the stable, the tidy yard where Daniel and Margaret were playing. "Zinnia," he said, his voice rough, "I've come to apologize." The conversation that followed was difficult and emotional. Maxwell explained that Roger Pemberton had been arrested 2 years earlier for killing a man in a drunken rage. The crime had been so egregious, Pemberton's behavior so obviously unhinged, that even his money and connections could not save him. He was currently serving a lengthy prison sentence. "I should have listened to you," Maxwell said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You tried to tell me what kind of man he was, and I dismissed your concerns. I valued business connections and money over your happiness and safety. I was a fool, and I have regretted it every day since I sent you away." Zinnia stood rigid, years of hurt and anger warring with the flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have some relationship with her father again. Beatrice stood beside her, ready to support whatever decision she made. "You abandoned me," Zinnia said, her voice shaking. "You sent me to a frontier town with barely any money, expecting me to break. You told me I was dead to you. You threw away your own daughter because she would not obey." "I know," Maxwell said. "I know, and I have no excuse. I was wrong, terribly wrong, and I understand if you cannot forgive me. But I had to come. I had to see you to tell you that I am sorry, to meet my grandchildren if you will allow it. I am an old man, Zinnia, and I have spent years building an empire that means nothing without family to share it with." Daniel, who had been watching the strange man with suspicion, suddenly piped up. "Are you our grandfather?" Maxwell looked at the boy, at his serious face and confident stance, and something in the old man's expression crumbled. "I hope I might be if your mother and father permit it." Beatrice squeezed Zinnia's hand, letting her know the decision was hers. She looked at her father, at the broken old man who had hurt her so badly, and then at her children, who deserved the chance to know their grandfather. "You cannot undo the past," she said finally. You cannot take back the pain you caused, but I am willing to try to move forward slowly if you truly mean your apology. My children will know their grandfather, but you will respect the life Beatrice and I have built. You will not try to control us or change us or impose your will on our choices. We make our own decisions now. I would not dream of interfering, Maxwell said quickly. I can see you have built something remarkable here. I am proud of you, Zinnia. I should have told you that years ago, but I am telling you now. I am so proud of the woman you have become. The reconciliation was slow and sometimes awkward, but it was real. Maxwell began visiting regularly, and to everyone's surprise, he and Beatrice developed a genuine friendship. The old businessman respected what Beatrice had built, admired his work ethic and integrity. He offered business advice without being pushy, and he doted on his grandchildren with the enthusiasm of a man making up for lost time. When Maxwell died peacefully in his sleep in 1888, he left his entire fortune to Zinnia, with a letter expressing his love and his pride in the life she had created. The inheritance was substantial enough to change their lives completely, but Zinnia and Beatrice chose to remain on their property, in the home they had built together. They used some of the money to make improvements and to ensure their children would have opportunities for education, but the core of their life remained unchanged. They had started with nothing but a frozen shack and stubborn determination. They had built something real and lasting through love and hard work. No amount of money could improve on that. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the milestones of their growing children. Daniel showed such skill with horses that by age 15, he was helping Beatrice train the more difficult animals. Margaret, despite being a girl in a time and place that often dismissed female capability, proved to have a sharp business mind and took over managing the financial aspects of the ranch. In 1892, Daniel married a sweet-natured girl from Frost Ridge named Catherine, and they built a house on the far edge of the property. In 1896, Margaret scandalized some of the more conservative neighbors by announcing her intention to study veterinary medicine, a field dominated entirely by men. Beatrice and Zinnia supported her completely, using part of Maxwell's inheritance to fund her education. As Beatrice and Zinnia moved into their 40s, they sometimes sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset and marveling at how their lives had unfolded. The frozen shack that had been intended as a joke was now part of a thriving ranch. The desperate young people who had found each other in Frost Ridge were now respected members of the community, parents and grandparents, people who had built something meaningful. You remember that first winter? Zinnia asked one evening in the fall of 1897. They were both graying now, lines on their faces that spoke of years of hard work and laughter. When you were chipping ice off this cabin and I was starving in a boarding house, and we had no idea we would end up here. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, Beatrice replied. Standing in that street with your chin up and your shoulders straight, refusing to let them see you break. I think I started falling in love with you right then. I think I started falling in love with you when you were the only person who bothered to help me, Zinnia said. Everyone else was too afraid or too indifferent, but you just walked up and carried my trunks without expecting anything in return. You were kind when you had no reason to be kind. That told me everything I needed to know about who you were. Beatrice pulled her closer, this woman who had transformed his life in ways he never could have imagined. I got so lucky the day the Bennetts decided to mock me with that frozen shack. If they had given me something actually valuable, I never would have met you. That terrible, frozen, falling-apart cabin was the best gift anyone ever gave me. Because it led you to me, Zinnia said, smiling. Because it led me to you, Beatrice agreed. And because it taught me that the value of something has nothing to do with its initial appearance. That shack was supposed to be worthless, but we made it precious. We filled it with love and determination and hope, and that made it worth more than any mansion. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear Daniel calling to his children, teaching them the same lessons about horses that Beatrice had taught him. The sound filled Beatrice with satisfaction so profound it was almost overwhelming. They had started with so little. A frozen shack, a cruel joke, two people desperate for something better. But they had built a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives. They had created a family, a home, a thriving business, and a love story that proved circumstances did not have to determine destiny. In 1899, when Beatrice and Zinnia celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered to honor them. Daniel, now a father of 3, gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Most people remember where they came from with sadness or longing," he said. "But you two taught us to remember where we came from with gratitude. You took nothing and made it everything. You took a frozen shack that was meant to break you and turned it into a foundation that has supported 3 generations. You showed us that love and determination can overcome any obstacle, that the value of a life is not measured by what you start with but by what you build." Beatrice looked around at the gathered family, at the faces of children and grandchildren, at the home they had created and the life they had built. He thought about the young man he had been, standing in the snow outside the Bennett mansion, looking at a deed to a worthless property, and trying to decide whether to give up or fight back. He had chosen to fight, and that choice had given him everything that mattered. Zinnia squeezed his hand under the table, and when he turned to look at her, he saw the same satisfaction and joy reflected in her eyes. They had done this together, every step of the way. Every challenge faced, every problem solved, every joy celebrated, all of it had been a shared journey. "Thank you," he said quietly, words meant only for her ears. "For taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but a frozen shack and impossible dreams." "Thank you," she replied, "for showing me that the best life is the one you build yourself, not the one others try to force on you. For loving me enough to offer me sanctuary, for being my partner in every sense of the word." They kissed, gently and sweetly, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had built from literally nothing. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, just as it had been falling that December day in 1878 when Beatrice first laid eyes on the frozen shack. But now that shack was a warm, welcoming home, filled with light and laughter and love. The joke had become a dream, and the dream had become a reality more beautiful than either of them could have imagined when they started. And as Beatrice held his wife close and listened to the sounds of their family celebrating around them, he knew with absolute certainty that he would not change a single thing about the journey that had brought them here. The frozen shack had been a gift after all, in the most unexpected way imaginable. It had given him everything he had ever wanted, everything he had never dared to hope for, wrapped in the form of one remarkable woman who had walked into his life when they both needed saving. And together, they had saved themselves. Years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of seasons changing in the Wyoming wilderness. By 1902, Beatrice was 58 years old, still strong but moving a bit more carefully these days, his hair completely gray but his eyes still sharp. Zinnia, at 53, remained beautiful in his eyes, her face weathered by sun and wind but glowing with the contentment of a life well lived. They had 7 grandchildren now, with an 8th on the way. Margaret had returned from veterinary school, and set up a practice in Frost Ridge, becoming the first female veterinarian in the territory, and earning respect through sheer competence and determination. Daniel ran the horse training business alongside Beatrice, preparing to take it over completely, as his father gradually stepped back from the most physically demanding work. The ranch had grown to encompass nearly 300 acres, a far cry from the original 40 acres and frozen shack. But that original cabin still stood, preserved carefully as a reminder of where everything had started. Sometimes Beatrice would walk out to it, running his hands over the logs he had painstakingly chinked that first desperate winter, remembering the bone-deep cold and the fear that he might not survive. On a warm spring afternoon in 1903, Zinnia found him standing outside the old cabin, lost in memory. She came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his with the ease of decades of practice. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "Everything," he replied. "How far we have come. How impossible it all seemed in the beginning. How many times we could have given up but chose to keep going instead." "You know what I think about when I look at this place?" Zinnia asked. "I think about the night I arrived, exhausted and frightened and trying so hard to appear brave. You had given me the bed, but I could not sleep because I was worried this was all a terrible mistake. And then I heard you get up to feed the fire, and I realized you were taking care of me even while I slept. That was when I knew, truly knew, that I was safe with you." Beatrice turned to face her, cupping her face gently in his weathered hands. "You were always safe with me. From the moment I saw you in Frost Ridge, I wanted nothing more than to protect you, to give you the life you deserved." "You gave me more than I deserved," Zinnia said. "You gave me freedom, respect, partnership, love. You made me feel valued in ways my father's wealth never did. You saw me as a person, not a possession or a prize to be won." They kissed, sweet and lingering, with the comfortable familiarity of a couple who had been together through every possible trial and triumph. When they pulled apart, Beatrice rested his forehead against hers. "I would do it all again," he said quietly. "Every frozen morning, every difficult day, every moment of doubt and fear. I would do it all again just to end up here with you." "So would I," Zinnia whispered. "So would I." That evening, as extended family gathered for Sunday dinner, a tradition they maintained whenever possible, Beatrice found himself watching the scene with deep satisfaction. The long table he had built years ago was packed with people, 3 generations sharing food and stories and laughter. Daniel's oldest son was telling an animated story about a particularly stubborn horse, gesturing wildly with his hands in a way that reminded Beatrice intensely of his own father, dead these 40 years, but never forgotten. Margaret was deep in conversation with her younger sister, Catherine, discussing the medical care of livestock with the kind of technical precision that would have been incomprehensible to Beatrice at their age. The younger grandchildren played in the yard, their shrieks of joy audible through the open windows. This was what success looked like, Beatrice realized. Not wealth or status or the approval of people who thought themselves important. Success was a table full of family, a home filled with love, a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. Success was knowing that the frozen shack meant as a joke had become the foundation for all of this. As the evening drew to a close and family members began heading to their own homes, Daniel approached his parents with an unusual expression on his face. "Father, Mother, I have something to tell you. Catherine is expecting again, but that is not the news." He paused, seeming uncertain how to continue. "A man came to the ranch this week. He said his name was Preston Bennett. He wanted to speak with you, Father." Beatrice felt Zinnia tense beside him. The Bennett name was not one they had heard in years, but it still carried uncomfortable associations. "What did he want?" Beatrice asked carefully. "He wanted to apologize," Daniel said. "He said his father and brother have both passed away, and he has spent the last few years reflecting on the way they treated people, specifically the way they treated you. He asked if he could come by and speak with you personally, but I told him I needed to ask you first." Beatrice exchanged a look with Zinnia. "What do you think?" he asked her. "I think," Zinnia said slowly, "that we have spent our lives proving that people can change and grow. If Preston Bennett truly wants to apologize, the least we can do is hear him out." So the following week, Preston Bennett arrived at the ranch. He was in his 60s now, his hair thinning, his face marked by illness or hard living or both. He looked nothing like the arrogant young man who had smirked while his father presented Beatrice with the deed to a worthless property. "Mr. Rowland, Mrs. Rowland," he said, his voice humble. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to ask for your time after the way my family treated you." They sat on the porch, the same porch where Beatrice and Zinnia had spent countless evenings over the years. Preston seemed uncomfortable, a man unaccustomed to admitting his failings. "I have thought about you often over the years," Preston began. "About that day we gave you the deed to this property. We thought it was hilarious, a poor cowboy thinking he could make something of that frozen wreck of a cabin. My father and brother laughed about it for weeks." Beatrice said nothing, simply waiting for Preston to continue. "But then we started hearing stories," Preston went on, "about how you had actually fixed the place up, how you were living there and making it work. My father was furious. He said you were making a mockery of our joke, making the Bennetts look foolish. He wanted to take the land back somehow, but of course he could not. The deed was legal and binding." "Why are you telling me this?" Beatrice asked quietly. "Because I need you to know that you were right, and we were wrong," Preston said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father died bitter and angry, convinced the world had treated him unfairly. My brother Edgar drank himself to death 5 years later. And I have spent my life realizing that we had everything, every possible advantage, and we squandered it by being cruel and arrogant. You had nothing, and you built an empire. You have a family who loves you, a business that thrives, a reputation for integrity and skill. Everything we should have had, you achieved through sheer determination and character." He pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table between them. "I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I wanted you to have this. It is the deed to the original Bennett Ranch. I am the last of the family, and I have no children. The property would just be sold off to strangers after I die. I want you to have it. Consider it restitution for the harm my family caused you, or simply the admission that you deserved better than what we gave you." Beatrice stared at the envelope, stunned. The Bennett Ranch was massive, thousands of acres of prime grazing land worth a fortune. It was more land than he could ever possibly need or use. "I cannot accept this," he said finally. "It is too much." "Please," Preston said. "It would mean something to me, to know that the land ends up with someone who will use it well, someone who understands its value. You turned a frozen shack into a home. Imagine what you could do with a real ranch." Beatrice looked at Zinnia, seeking her wisdom. She studied Preston carefully, then nodded slowly. "We will accept it," she said, "but not as restitution. Consider it the final chapter of this story. The joke that became a dream is now expanding into something even larger. We will use the land well, Preston. We will make sure it serves a good purpose." Preston left shortly after, looking lighter somehow, as though delivering the deed had lifted a burden he had been carrying for years. After he was gone, Beatrice and Zinnia sat in silence for a long time, processing what had just happened. "We started with a frozen shack meant to humiliate me," Beatrice said finally. "And now we own one of the largest ranches in the territory. It is almost impossible to believe." "Believe it," Zinnia said, taking his hand. "We earned every acre through hard work and integrity. The Bennett family gave us the shack, but we made everything else ourselves. This is just the universe acknowledging what we have always known. We were never worthless, never less than anyone else. We always had value, we always had potential. We just needed the chance to prove it." They decided to keep the Bennett ranch largely intact, using it to expand their horse breeding operation. Daniel would oversee the new property, preparing to pass it eventually to his own children. Margaret helped design facilities for treating and rehabilitating injured horses, turning part of the ranch into a sanctuary for animals that needed specialized care. The work was enormous, but they had help now, family and hired hands and a community that respected them. The joke had become a dream, and the dream had become a legacy that would span generations. In the spring of 1908, Beatrice and Zinnia celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a grand party that brought together everyone whose lives they had touched. People came from as far as Cheyenne and Denver, ranchers and business people and ordinary folks who remembered kindness shown to them years earlier. Samuel Greaves, now in his 90s and still sharp as ever, gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying simultaneously. "I remember the first time Beatrice Rowland walked into my store," he said, his voice still strong despite his advanced age. "He was buying supplies to survive in that God-forsaken cabin, and I thought he was the craziest or bravest man I had ever met. Probably both. And then I remember when Zinnia Ellington arrived, a rich girl dumped in our little town like unwanted baggage. I thought she would be gone within a month." He paused for effect. "I have never been so happy to be wrong." These two people took everything life threw at them and turned it into something beautiful. They proved that circumstances do not determine destiny, that love and determination can overcome any obstacle. They built a family, a business, a legacy. And they did it all starting from a frozen shack that was meant to be a joke. The crowd erupted in applause, and Beatrice felt Zinnia's hand tighten around his. They stood together, facing the room full of people they loved, and Beatrice felt overwhelmed by the sheer improbability of it all. "I want to say something," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted, everyone turning to listen. 30 years ago, I was given what was meant to be the cruelest joke anyone had ever played on me," he began. "A frozen, worthless shack in the middle of nowhere, presented as though it were a real gift. I could have given up. I could have walked away, could have let that joke define me. But I was too stubborn, too determined to prove I was worth something." He pulled Zinnia closer to his side. "And then I met this woman, this remarkable woman who had also been cast aside by people who should have valued her. We found each other at the exact moment we both needed saving, and we saved each other. We took that joke and turned it into a dream. We filled a frozen shack with warmth and love and hope, and everything you see here today, all of this, grew from that foundation." His voice grew thick with emotion. "I have been blessed beyond measure. I have a wife who is my partner in every sense of the word. I have children who make me proud every single day. I have grandchildren who will carry our legacy forward into the future. I have land and horses and a community that respects me. But none of it, not a single bit of it, would exist without that frozen shack and the woman I found there." He turned to face Zinnia directly, taking both her hands in his. "You are the love of my life, Zinnia Rowland. You are the reason I wake up every morning grateful to be alive. You took a chance on a poor cowboy with nothing but impossible dreams, and you made those dreams come true simply by standing beside me. I love you more today than I did 30 years ago, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for making a joke into a dream, and a dream into a life more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. Zinnia was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears. I love you too, she said, her voice breaking. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Thank you for showing me that strength comes in many forms, that kindness is never wasted, that love can transform anything. You gave me freedom and purpose, and a family I cherish with my whole heart. This frozen shack joke became the greatest gift of my life. They kissed while their family and friends cheered, 30 years of love and partnership distilled into that single moment. When they finally pulled apart, Beatrice looked out at the crowd and smiled. Eat, drink, and celebrate, he called out. Because this joke turned out pretty well, I think. The party continued late into the night, filled with music and dancing and storytelling. Grandchildren fell asleep in corners, wrapped in blankets their grandmother had sewn. Adults shared memories and made plans for the future. And through it all, Beatrice and Zinnia remained at the center, holding hands and soaking in the joy of their life together. As the guests began to depart and the night grew quiet, Beatrice and Zinnia found themselves once again standing by the old cabin, the place where everything had truly begun. The structure was weathered now, showing its age, but it remained solid, a testament to the work Beatrice had done all those years ago. Should we go inside? Zinnia asked. Just for a moment. They ducked through the low doorway into the single room that had been their entire world for that first year together. It was empty now, the furniture long since moved to newer buildings, but the space held memories so thick you could almost touch them. I slept on the floor right there, Beatrice said, pointing, and I lay awake every night marveling that you were here, that you had chosen to come with me. I sat at that table and learned to cook on a wood stove, Zinnia added, smiling at the memory. I burned so many meals at first, but you ate them anyway and told me they were delicious. They were, Beatrice insisted, and they both laughed. They stood in the center of the small room, arms around each other, and Beatrice felt the weight of all the years pressing down on him in the best possible way. This room had held so much fear, so much hope, so much love. It had been the crucible in which their marriage was forged, the foundation on which everything else was built. We were so young, Zinnia said softly. So frightened and determined and absolutely certain we could make it work despite all the reasons we should fail. We were right to be certain, Beatrice replied. Look at what we built. Look at what this frozen joke became. They stayed there a while longer, honoring the space and the memories it held. Then they walked back to the main house, to the comfortable bed they shared, and the life they had created together. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, as they had done for 30 years, secure in the knowledge that they had transformed a cruel joke into the most beautiful dream imaginable. The years continued their steady march forward. Beatrice and Zinnia grew older, their movements slower but their love undiminished. They watched their grandchildren grow into adults, saw great-grandchildren born, and knew their legacy would extend far beyond their own lifetimes. In the winter of 1915, on a cold, clear night with stars brilliant overhead, Beatrice Rowland passed away peacefully in his sleep, with Zinnia beside him and his children gathered close. He was 71 years old, and he had lived a life rich beyond measure. Zinnia mourned him with the depth of someone who had lost not just a husband but a true partner, her other half. But she also celebrated him, telling stories to anyone who would listen about the cowboy who had been given a frozen shack as a joke, and turned it into an empire built on love and determination. She lived another 7 years, surrounded by family, respected throughout the territory as a woman of wisdom and strength. When she died in the summer of 1922, at the age of 77, her last words were reported to be, "I am coming, Beatrice. Wait for me." They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built, with a view of the mountains they had both loved. Their headstone was simple: Beatrice and Zinnia Rowland together. They proved that love can transform anything. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of their descendants, generation after generation maintaining the values and work ethic that had been instilled from the very beginning. The old cabin was eventually preserved as a historical site, with a plaque explaining its significance. This cabin was given to Beatrice Rowland in 1878 as a cruel joke by the wealthy family he worked for. Instead of accepting defeat, Rowland restored the cabin and built a life here. When he fell in love with Zinnia Ellington, together they transformed this frozen shack into the foundation of one of the most successful ranches in Wyoming. Their story demonstrates that determination, love, and hard work can overcome any obstacle. Visitors would come to see the cabin, to stand in the small room and imagine the young couple who had started with nothing and built everything. Some saw it as inspiration, proof that circumstances need not determine destiny. Others saw it as a love story, a testament to finding the right partner and building a life together. But perhaps the best legacy of Beatrice and Zinnia Rowland was not the land or the money or even the historical significance. Their best legacy was the family they created, generations of people who understood that true wealth was measured in love and character, not status or possessions. People who knew that the value of something had nothing to do with its initial appearance, that a frozen shack could become a palace if it was filled with the right things. The joke had become a dream, and the dream had become a legend that would be told for generations to come. And at the heart of that legend was a simple truth: love, combined with determination and mutual respect, could transform anything. Even a frozen shack in the wilderness of Wyoming territory, given as a cruel joke to a man with nothing but big dreams and a stubborn heart. That frozen shack had held two people who needed each other desperately, who saved each other in the ways that mattered most, who built a life together that proved more valuable than all the wealth and status in the world. And in the end, that was the greatest joke of all on the Bennett family, who had meant to humiliate Beatrice Rowland. Because that worthless frozen shack became the birthplace of a love story for the ages, the foundation of a legacy that would outlast any amount of money or social position. The Bennetts had given away something they thought was worthless, and had accidentally given Beatrice Rowland the most precious gift imaginable: the place where he would build his life with the woman he loved. And that made the frozen shack worth more than any mansion could ever be.